Ethan's eyes locked onto the dog's pitiful form as he slowed the car. The dog was curled on the side of the road, its body thin and frail, covered in dirt, its eyes wide with pain. It whimpered softly, the sound faint but unmistakable, and in that moment, Ethan knew he couldn't just drive past. He pulled over, the gravel crunching under the tires as he parked, his heart already hammering in his chest. For a second, Ethan just stared at the dog. It was alone. There was no one around, no one to help it. Just the soft, weak cries that seemed to grow louder as he stepped closer. The dog's body quivered with each breath it took, as if it was struggling to keep going. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight with the weight of what he was seeing. The dog had been abandoned, left to suffer, and he had no idea why. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was that it needed him. His feet moved before he had time to think. He knelt down slowly, speaking softly to the dog, though his voice barely broke the silence around them. "It's okay," he said, his words shaky, trying to reassure the animal, but he wasn't sure if it understood. The dog didn't flinch or run away. Instead, it looked up at him, its eyes clouded with fear, but also with a strange, desperate trust. Ethan reached out, his hands trembling as he gently touched the dog's fur. It was colder than he expected, its body weak under his touch. The dog let out another soft whimper, its head lifting slightly as though trying to move but unable to. Ethan's chest tightened, and he felt something in him stir, something deep, something powerful. He couldn't leave it like this. He couldn't walk away and pretend he hadn't seen it. His mind raced for what to do. He had no idea what was wrong with the dog, how long it had been out here, or what kind of help it needed. But what he did know was that it was suffering, and the world seemed to be passing it by without a second thought. He had to help. He had to do something. Ethan gently scooped the dog into his arms, the small, fragile body feeling like nothing more than skin and bone. It barely reacted, but Ethan could feel its shallow breathing, could sense the exhaustion that had overcome it. He stood up slowly, his heart in his throat, as he looked around for help. There was no one else. The world felt like it was moving on, indifferent to the small life in his arms, but that didn't matter. Not now. With the dog still cradled in his arms, Ethan made his way back to the car. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, that the road ahead might be just as uncertain as the one that had led him here. But he wasn't going to leave it behind, not now, not when it had trusted him, when it was reaching out for something, anything, to save it. And in that moment, Ethan knew that whatever happened next, he had made the right choice. Ethan gently placed the dog on the passenger seat, his hands still trembling as he buckled it in. The dog didn't move much, its eyes half closed, too weak to react. It let out a low, pained whimper, and Ethan's heart ached. He didn't know how long it had been out here, abandoned, or how long it had been suffering. He didn't even know what had caused its condition, but in that moment, none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was getting it to safety. He slammed the door shut and got into the driver's seat, his mind racing as he turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, but it felt distant, muffled. Ethan's thoughts kept drifting back to the dog, to its fragile body, its soft cries. The drive to the clinic seemed impossibly long. Every bump in the road made him wince, worried that the dog might not make it. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white, but his mind kept replaying the same thing over and over. I have to save it. Every time the dog shifted, a pang of worry surged through Ethan. He glanced at it constantly, watching for any sign of change, but the dog remained still. Its breathing was shallow, its eyes barely open. Ethan's gut twisted with the realization that it might not make it if they didn't get help soon. What if the clinic was too far away? What if it was too late? The guilt weighed heavily on him. He couldn't help but wonder if he could have done more. What if he had stopped sooner? What if he had seen the dog earlier? But there was no time for regret now. He couldn't undo what had happened. All he could do was keep going, keep trying, and hope that it would be enough. He arrived at the clinic in a haze, the distance between him and the animal world narrowing with each second. The staff rushed out to meet him as he pulled into the parking lot, and Ethan barely had the strength to open the door. His arms were sore from holding the dog for so long, but he knew it had to be moved carefully. He gingerly lifted the dog from the car, his heart racing with every small sound the dog made. They took the dog inside immediately, their faces serious but kind. Ethan stood back, his hands shaking as he watched the medical team work quickly, their movements precise as they connected IVs, examined the dog, and worked to stabilize its condition. The room was quiet except for the soft beeping of the monitors and the rustle of the staff working. Ethan felt like an outsider, standing in the corner of the room, but his heart was with the dog. He couldn't leave until he knew it was okay. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, one of the nurses turned to him. "He's stable now," she said softly. Ethan exhaled, the weight of relief washing over him. He hadn't failed. The dog was going to make it. Ethan nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and sat down, his body sinking into the chair. The fight wasn't over, but for now, they had won. The dog had a chance, and so did he. The next few days were a blur. Ethan returned to the clinic each day, sitting quietly by the dog's side. The cub, as the staff had started calling it, was slowly recovering. Its body was no longer as cold, its breathing steadier, and its eyes began to show signs of life. Ethan watched every small movement, his heart lifting with each one. The cub no longer flinched when the nurses touched it, no longer whimpered in pain. There were moments when it seemed to recognize Ethan, its tired gaze meeting his with an unspoken understanding. But there were also moments when it looked lost, its eyes filled with a deep sorrow that cut Ethan to the core. The trauma it had endured still lingered, and there were times when it would pull away from any human touch, as though it feared being abandoned again. Ethan couldn't blame it. He knew that kind of fear, the kind that ran deep, the kind that came from being left alone when you were too young to understand why. But each day, the cub grew stronger, and Ethan was there, never leaving its side, offering quiet comfort, as much for himself as for the cub. There were no promises in his heart, just a quiet hope that they could make it. He talked to the cub every day, even though he wasn't sure if it understood him. He told it about his life, his family, and the work he did. It was the kind of silly conversation he'd have with a dog, but it was also a way to bridge the gap between them, a way to connect. As the cub rested, Ethan would keep his hand on its back just to remind it that it wasn't alone. One afternoon, as Ethan sat by the cub's enclosure, it stirred. The cub's eyes opened wide, blinking as if it were seeing the world for the first time. It stood up shakily, its legs wobbly but determined. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he watched it take its first few steps. The cub seemed so small, so fragile, but there was something about the way it moved that made Ethan believe it could overcome anything. It was as if, in that moment, the cub had decided to live. Ethan couldn't contain the smile that spread across his face. He stood up slowly, watching the cub take another few steps, gaining confidence. This was a miracle, a testament to the strength of this tiny creature who had been so close to giving up. And in some way, it felt like the cub had done more than just survive. It had found a reason to keep going, a reason to trust again. But even as the cub grew stronger, Ethan knew the real test was coming. The moment would arrive when he would have to let it go, to release it back into the wild, where it belonged. He wasn't ready, not yet. But for now, all he could do was watch this incredible transformation, this journey of healing, and let the cub take its time. This was more than just about saving a life. It was about giving it the chance to live, to find its place in the world once again. And Ethan would be there for every step, every moment, as long as the cub needed him. The day the cub took its first few unsteady steps, something inside Ethan shifted. He watched, his heart pounding, as the little creature wobbled forward, its legs still weak, but its determination unmistakable. It was more than just a physical recovery. It was a shift in spirit, a sign that it was finally starting to understand that it was safe, that it wasn't alone anymore. Ethan crouched down beside the enclosure, leaning in closer, his breath held as the cub made its way to the far side, still trembling, but walking without falling. The sight of it made his throat tighten, an overwhelming mix of pride and fear coursing through him. The cub had been so close to death. Ethan had seen the life drained from its tiny body, the terror in its eyes, and now here it was, moving again, finding its footing. He had never imagined how such a small creature could carry so much weight, so much pain, and still fight to survive. The cub's struggle was more than just physical. It had been broken, emotionally scarred in ways that no one could truly understand. And yet, it was still here. It was still trying. Ethan stood back and let the cub move at its own pace, quietly observing, letting it find its strength. He knew it wasn't just about healing physically. The cub needed time to recover emotionally, too. There were moments when it would stop, looking around as if unsure, its body tensing at every sound, its eyes still filled with doubt. Ethan would speak to it, softly, reassuringly, trying to fill the silence with calm words, even if they didn't fully understand. Days passed, and the cub began to grow more confident. It started to explore the enclosure, sniffing around, curiously investigating its surroundings. Ethan noticed the way it would follow his movements with its eyes, the small gestures of trust that had once been so far out of reach. The cub was starting to trust again, beginning to believe that it wasn't going to be abandoned. But as the days went on, the reality of what would come next hung heavy in the air. Ethan had watched the cub survive against all odds, had done everything in his power to help it, but he knew the time was coming when it would have to leave. The cub couldn't stay in the safety of the clinic forever. It belonged in the wild, among its own kind. And as much as Ethan wanted to keep it, to hold on to this bond they had formed, he knew deep down that letting go was the right thing to do. It wasn't just about healing. It was about returning the cub to where it truly belonged. The thought of it left a pit in his stomach. The cub had become a part of him, a piece of his heart that he wasn't sure he could bear to lose. But as he watched it grow stronger, as he saw the light in its eyes return, he knew it was ready. The hardest part of kindness, Ethan realized, was knowing when to let go. And when the time came, he would have to let the cub go, back to the wild, where it was meant to be. But for now, he watched it carefully. And in that moment, he allowed himself to feel a little peace. The cub was alive. And that, for now, was enough. The day Ethan had been dreading arrived sooner than he expected. The cub had regained its strength, its body now full of muscle, its eyes brighter, its movements more confident. It was clear to Ethan that the cub was ready to return to the wild, but that didn't make the decision any easier. Each time he saw the cub stretch its legs and explore, it felt like a part of him was slipping away. He had grown so attached to the little creature, and the thought of letting it go left a weight in his chest. Ethan stood in front of the cub's enclosure, watching it pace back and forth, its tail flicking behind it as it adjusted to the space. It was like a part of him was still trying to hold on, to find some reason not to release it. But the cub had been through so much. It had survived against all odds, and now it needed to return to the life it was meant for. Ethan knew that, deep down, he couldn't keep it here forever. It belonged to the wild. He sat down on the bench outside the enclosure, his thoughts tangled. The cub, now full of energy, approached the bars, its eyes searching for him. It was still uncertain at times, but the bond between them was undeniable. It had learned to trust him, to rely on him for comfort, for protection. And Ethan had learned from it too. He had learned about resilience, about the kind of love that didn't ask for anything in return. This cub had opened his heart in ways he never thought possible. As the cub moved closer to the bars, Ethan felt a pang in his chest. He reached out a hand, running his fingers gently through the bars. The cub nudged his hand with its nose, its small body pressing against him as if it could feel the weight of his emotions. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight. It was in that moment that he realized just how much he had come to care for it, how much it had come to mean to him. But he had to let it go. He knew that. It was the only way for the cub to truly heal, to live the life it deserved. Ethan stood up slowly, the decision weighing heavily on him. He unlocked the enclosure and stepped inside. The cub, sensing something was different, hesitated for a moment. But then it took a few tentative steps forward, looking up at him one last time. Ethan smiled softly, his voice cracking as he whispered, "You're ready. You've made it. Go." With those words, the cub slowly walked toward the open door, its steps unsure at first, but growing more confident with each stride. Ethan's heart broke as he watched it take its first steps toward freedom, toward a life he could never give it. But he didn't regret a single moment. The cub had come into his life when it needed him the most, and now it was ready to face the world on its own. Ethan stood there, watching it disappear into the distance, a lump in his throat and tears in his eyes. He had saved its life. And in doing so, the cub had saved him, teaching him the true meaning of selflessness, of letting go. Ethan sat on the dirt-covered bench, his eyes fixed on the empty path the cub had just walked down. His chest felt hollow, and a deep ache settled within him. The cub was gone, out there somewhere, returning to its rightful place in the wild. The decision to let it go had been the hardest thing he'd ever done, and now that it was over, he felt an emptiness he wasn't sure how to fill. The silence of the moment pressed down on him like a weight, and for a long while he sat still, watching the open space where the cub had disappeared. He had promised himself he would be strong, that he wouldn't let his emotions get the best of him, but as time passed, it became clear just how much of his heart had gone with the cub. It had been more than just a rescue. It had been a connection. He had saved its life, but in doing so it had opened his heart in ways he never imagined. The days following the cub's departure felt long and heavy. Ethan returned to the clinic, but everything seemed different. The space felt quieter without the cub's presence, without its tentative steps toward him each morning. He missed the way it would nuzzle his hand, how it had looked up at him with eyes full of trust. But now, as he walked the familiar paths of the clinic, a new understanding filled him. The cub was out there, living the life it was meant for, and Ethan had been a part of that. He had given it a chance to be free. Ethan found himself revisiting their time together. He remembered the first day he found the cub, so small, so fragile. He thought about the countless hours he spent beside it, offering what little comfort he could. Every moment, every struggle had been worth it. The cub had survived, and that was all that mattered. One afternoon, as he sat in his office, a message arrived at the clinic. It was from a local wildlife tracker, someone who often worked in the area. The message was brief, but it made Ethan's heart skip a beat. The cub was spotted. It's alive, and it's thriving. A rush of emotions flooded through Ethan. He didn't know how the cub had managed to survive on its own, but hearing that it was out there, free and living as it should, brought an overwhelming sense of peace. The fear that had gripped him since the moment he had let it go faded, replaced by the knowledge that he had made the right choice. He smiled, the first real smile in days. The cub was out there, finding its way in the world, just like it was meant to. Ethan had done what he needed to do, and as he thought of that, he realized something. The act of kindness he had given to the cub had not only changed the cub's life, it had changed his own. He had learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go. The cub had found its freedom, and in doing so, so had he. Ethan sat at his desk, staring at the small photo of the cub pinned to the corkboard in front of him. He hadn't realized how much the cub had affected him until it was gone. It wasn't just the act of saving it that mattered. It was everything that came after. The trust they had built, the quiet bond they had shared in those silent moments. He never thought he could form such a connection with an animal, but in those weeks of caring for it, he had learned more than he could ever put into words. The cub had become a part of him, and now he felt its absence like an empty space in his chest. The news of its survival had lifted his spirits, but it didn't fill the void. Every now and then, he'd catch himself thinking about the cub, wondering where it was, if it was adjusting to its new life, if it was thriving. It was hard to let go, but Ethan knew it was the right thing to do. The cub was free, and that was more than he could have hoped for. In the days that followed, Ethan found himself sharing the cub's story more often with the people around him, friends, family, colleagues at the clinic. It wasn't just about the cub anymore, though. It was about the importance of choosing kindness, of taking the time to stop when no one else would. He realized that the choice he had made that day, stopping to help a dog on the side of the road, had led him to something far bigger than he had ever imagined. The act of kindness, the decision to care for something when the world seemed too busy to notice, had changed his life. Ethan began to volunteer more, not just at the clinic but in his community. He helped organize awareness campaigns for stray animals, spoke at schools about the importance of compassion, and reached out to those who needed help but didn't have a voice. The story of the cub became his story too, and he shared it because it was a reminder to himself and others that kindness, even in its smallest form, had the power to transform lives. There were moments, though, when the emptiness crept back. Moments when the world felt too fast, too indifferent. But each time that feeling returned, Ethan would think of the cub, the way it had looked at him with trust, how it had fought to live despite everything. And he realized that every act of kindness ripples outward, reaching places he couldn't even see. As he sat back in his chair, reflecting on everything that had happened, Ethan knew that the cub had given him a gift he hadn't expected. It had taught him that the simplest gestures, pausing to help, showing up when it mattered, could change everything. And that lesson stayed with him, guiding him forward. If you're reading this, think about the moments where you've made a choice to act with kindness. Sometimes it's the smallest of actions that leave the biggest marks. What can you do today to make a difference, no matter how small? Because, just like Ethan did for the cub, you might change someone's world forever, simply by choosing to care,